CRO is the job of more than one person, but how do you handle that in an organization? Welcome to the Treachery of Data podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite sized chunk of content summarizing what was discussed last week. Yeah, so, one of the interesting topics that came up was, hey, I'm building out a CRO department, or I'm, working at an agency or in house, things like that. Like, this is particularly a pain point that I'm going through personally, having just started on as a director of CRO at an agency that didn't prior have a CRO department. And it's my job to build that entire department out from scratch, having previously, worked with other agencies and mostly done solo consulting. This is a totally new thing for me. And then, but you've done a lot of this in house. So you have oodles of experience there as well. And there's s- lots of similarities and overlap between setting things up between, both agency and in house side.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I missed the round table on Friday. So when we were before the call, we were kind of discussing what were we going to talk about, and I thought this was really interesting because I've never set up um, a a department in an agency or tech I kind of I've, you know, but I do have some experience from an in-house company perspective. And I thought that was going to be an interesting dynamic to talk about. Like, what are the commonalities? What are the differences? What are the
Mhm.
challenges? Are the challenge? So yeah, I think this could be a interesting discussion.
Yeah. So to kick it off, I think there's sort of three sort of basic ways to go about it. Right, and I've seen this reiterated in, like, lots of LinkedIn posts from CRO people, and I think we've actually discussed this a couple times before on the roundtable as well, and that's to start with, more broadly, like, how do you handle experimentation within the organization as a whole? Like, the traditional, more straightforward approach is you set up a dedicated department to execute on it, right? And whether that's, an individual or a team, they're handling all experimentation within the organization, you know. Um, Benefit of that is high quality control because it's a dedicated team handling everything. Um, Drawback is throughput bottleneck, right? If you have if your CRO department is a small team, or even more likely, like, probably some like a single individual to start off with, well, there's a finite amount of work that that person or that team can accomplish. So you're bottlenecking yourself in terms of experimentation output. If you want to scale up really quickly and be like, oh, we want to run, hundreds of experiments a month. Well, a singular team responsible for doing everything, that's just too much work for them to handle. The opposite way is a decentralized approach where you're saying uh, everybody in the organization is empowered to execute and run experiments, right? So, anybody has an idea about something that they want to do with the website. Customer support person has fielded a whole bunch of calls from customers saying, we have, difficulty doing this thing on the website, and they have an idea. Well, what if we made this change? They're empowered to run an experiment themselves. Or, someone on the marketing team wants to evaluate the effectiveness of their copywriting, and so they've run A/B tests on copy. They're empowered to do it themselves, right? The drawback with that, though, is not lack of quality control, but a higher variability in the level of quality prov in experimentation output, because not everybody is going to have the same level of investment, skill set, knowledge, expertise in how to run an experiment. Like, not necessarily understanding, like, statistical pre-planning and like, oh, we need to run the experiment for this period of time. You open yourself up to like, oh, they're just showing 95% confidence after 2 days, and it's like 300% improvement, but it's moving from 10 to 13 conversions or something, right? You're dealing with issues of sample size just because someone's not doesn't understand the statistics behind a test, right?
And let's say there's a third option, which is like a
Mhm.
hybrid approach, where
Mhm.
certain stuff is kind of still going through a specific department, or the department is being seen as a center of excellence, just there to sign off and just to cover off some stuff. Whereas the rest of it is kind of still decentralized. So it's kind of like maybe like an 80-20 rule where 80% of the tests are being run decentralized, and then there's like a certain amount which needs oversight from a central department for complex tests, or of, just to make sure that things are going on the right track, or just an additional kind of like a QA out of open office sort of thing, just to verify that it's meeting all of the relevant requirements and they're up to the standard, before you launch a test. So yeah,
Yeah, you
yeah. So
have sort of like they kind of act like not necessarily gatekeepers, but more like proofers and teachers for overcoming that hurdle of quality in experimentation. Like they're saying, you want to start running it like, you say anybody in the organization can run experiments, but they have to like utilize these resources and have this particular level of knowledge in order to be cleared to run experiments, essentially.
yeah. So basically, when it comes to the going through dividing the labor, as it were, of an experiment, um, or an experiment program, you have like strategist, analyst, engineer, developer, QA, UX designers. You could have product owner, marketing owner, CPO, or CMO, etc. So, what
All
was
the different
what?
roles that are involved in experimentation.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So, what,
or at least the task responsibilities, right? Like there can be overlap between those 2, and there almost certainly will be when in the early stages, right? Like, depending on budget and resources and availability, like like exactly in the situation that I'm going through, I'm building out a department from scratch, but my availability of budget is that I can't go whole hog and hire like developers and design. Like I can't have like a dedicated person for each specific task role, nor will, and the expectation is also there is like, there's not going to be, because I'm building it out on an agency side, like we don't have the existing customer base to say like, oh, there's not going to be enough like experimentation work right off the bat for us to have like a singularly dedicated developer on staff who's just building, doing experiment engineering work.
So how are you handling that then? That challenge of, you can't hire, maybe not a UX designer, QA analyst, specific strategic person, strategic product, or
Yeah.
somebody to liaise with the client. So how have you been dividing the overall tasks from sending an experiment program, setting up the strategy, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Because previously to this, I was a one-stop shop. Like I was a solo consultant, solo practitioner. So I was literally doing everything that was required for running experimentation programs for clients. Um, and so first thing to recognize there is, what are the things that have the easiest amount, not easiest, but like most tangentially related overlap? So if you think of, the traditional like T-shaped skill set, right? Where if levels of expertise in different tangentially related skills, someone's typically strong in one particular area, but then as they drift to the left or to the right, your expertise becomes less. And so the first thing I did was like map map those out like on a spectrum and say, okay, if I need to hire someone, what's the area that's going to most need to be fulfilled on, and then like what's the most directly opposing thing, so I can extract those two out. And within that, like strategist, analyst, and designer have the most direct overlap between the three. So that was like the first role that I was hiring for. And then that person is explicitly not a developer, because that's a different enough skill set where you're going to be it's going to be harder, and you're probably paying a premium for someone that can literally still do everything. And it's like, because that's sort of a quote unquote unicorn type of person, that's not a scalable solution to say, "Oh, we're just gonna keep hiring unicorns and, like, give them 5 clients and just do that forever," because everybody's working within their own isolated bubble, right? So first thing, like, strategically, at least for me, the thing that made the most sense was extract developer out of that, and developer is a separate role. Now, within the agency that I'm working with now, they already had some engineering resources available. And so it was a matter of like making those engineers accessible to the CRO department, and then training them up on how to build and do development work for A/B tests. If you're already a web developer, it's not that much more that you need to learn to figure out how to do dev work for A/B tests. So that was the first sort of piece of the puzzle there of like, okay, I have to like start down some specialization path for scalability purposes.
So I think that's interesting because because being in house, I had the opposite problem. Because one of the advantages I see of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically because you have so fewer heads in the chain for creating an experiment. There's fewer places for nuances of the experiment requirements to be lost
Mhm.
during that transition from idea to a final experiment. One of the things that working in house and having all of those heads available, like we've got the separate design team or even specific designer per team. Um, somebody, an analyst, you've got a product owner, you've got a developer, you've got all of these kind of skills separated into individual teams, individual people, etc. And one of the things is kind of making sure that from one step to the other, the experiment idea design strategy is maintained through each and every single one.
Oh, yeah. That's a really good point.
Yeah,
Like, the more people that are involved in the process, the more
diluted.
potential, yeah, places
Well,
for
virtual
breakdown.
dilution. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so finding that appropriate balance.
Yeah, and for that, I mean, the only way, well, I could think of to get through that is one to have like you can't have catch up meetings for every single test with the whole team because
Yeah.
that becomes at the scale that we were running at, it's just going to be unfeasible. So instead, there's lots of procedures and kind of like almost like automating certain things and making sure that there's a standard process that everybody goes through at each and every single point, and then that is then maintained. That hopefully maintains the entire experiment idea from start to finish, and that documentation along the way in the form of a Jira ticket or whatever, in terms of just to make sure that everything's being done, in terms of like procedures being followed for adding metrics or whatever, deciding what the metrics are. Yeah. So it becomes like, that center of excellence, or that's, somebody has to be responsible, usually the product owner, to ensure that, each and every single step is maintained throughout that process.
Where when you were working that way, and I saw this a bit when I was, like, doing contracting work with agencies and stuff, like, what were some of the common points of breakdown that you ran into?
The common points of break were basically,
Like,
uh,
things would get gunked up or it'd be like, "Oh, something got lost in translation," or whatever.
most of the time, it was the fact that the metrics weren't there, or the metrics weren't capturing in the way that we expect them to capture, or that
Are you talking about, like, metrics of like, pre-planning metrics? Like, lack of understanding of, like, "Oh, like, this test won't work just because there won't be enough, like, sample?" Or was it more of like, a breakdown in, like, telemetry, like, tracking, like, goal data and things like that?
tracking. So that was kind of like the key thing. So tracking, that was something that we saw was falling down, and so we had to have a separate meeting for that. In terms of collecting, instead of doing it per test, doing it per group of tests, and putting another meeting in place. Another one was kind of like, and you're absolutely right in terms of like the general sort of idea of the test. So basically going from an idea through to design, through to output of that design, through to development. Sometimes you can lose track of what was the purpose of that test in the first place. Where in the design, it kind of goes, well, this isn't going to quite work. You know what? This might work. And then when it comes to development, the developers kind of go, oh, that's not going to work. It's going to take a lot of time. But maybe if we did this, and by the time you know it, what you've got as a final thing that the developers are
You
going to
spent a
develop,
month figuring out that this was something that you couldn't do.
or rather that it's you end up with something that doesn't meet the initial why you're running the experiment in the
Mhm,
first place.
mhm.
So it's not going to meet the original goals. It's now morphed into a very different type of test where all of the prioritization you did was kind of like it's kind of like slipped through the radar and kind of become this mole, as like this other experiment, which is
Too
now.
much, like, scope or feature creep or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
it can happen very, very gradually. So yeah, yeah. And usually what I found is like you need a product owner, and you need also to have some sort of metrics on the quality of the experiment as well, to make sure that as you're creating experiments en masse, your quality of experiments uh, is being kept up to date. So you need some sort of metric to let you know how good is my process working. Do I need to tweak the process or whatever? So yeah,
Because 'Cause we've talked multiple times about tracking experiment metadata.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
What were some of the things specifically that you would use to evaluate experiment quality?
So the main one was test how many times tests were launched, and then for whatever uh, issue, they have to be paused, reworked, and relaunched. So maybe like metrics were missing, maybe the count, the where the users were being counted was missing, because we had to, as a given, as an additional complexity, because we're working on a single page application, that the developers had to trigger at the point, like they had to send an
Mhm.
event to say, and count these users at this location. So and that was one of the key things I always was always something that kind of like falling through, because a lot of the tests were being done server side. So therefore they had to, and because of single page application, they had to trigger those requests separately. So yeah, quality in terms of data, in terms of like uh, how, when you put a test up, does it stay up? How long or does it have to come down and have to be redeveloped to go back up again? And the other thing is how many defects you see overall across all the tests, maybe like overlapping. Something we talked about before was overlaying tests and extreme interactions. How often extreme interactions occurred. Also, another one is how long is the process taking from going from design to final development of the test. Are there hiccups along that way?
Well,
Um,
there's an important piece there that I don't want to gloss over, where you're talking
mm,
about like tracking amount of time. So breaking your experiment construction process up into discrete phases
yeah,
and track like evaluating and tracking how much time does it take an experiment to go from phase to phase. I do exactly the same thing, and like here's how I do it. I have an idea stage, planning, build, QA, active, and complete, right? And those are
yes,
all the there you could be more or less granular depending on your needs, but, like, those are sort of the basic stage. Idea stage is this test is just an idea, a problem, a question, something that somebody's come up with, and it's, you know, um, that something there can really sit there indefinitely as
yeah,
well, because there's there that's like your backlog. That's like way longer that you should have a healthy backlog there. Planning stage is like planning, s- test pre-calc, prioritization, like things going in there. That should generally be a very, very short time frame, right? And then build. I mean, okay, this test is the next in the priority. We've decided this one's the one that we're going to build. How long does it then take to build to go into QA? How many rounds of QA does something go through? And then active, like, has it been active? Does it need a restart? How long did it run? Uh, et cetera, et cetera. Like
yeah,
you could easily break out like a separate design phase in there as well. If a test needs like UX design work
yeah.
associated with it.
And also, just to hone in on that point about the meetings as well. One thing that I used to track, like a lot of this tracking wasn't there as a kind of like formal dashboard or whatever. Is it just like somebody needs to be tracking, like, how we doing through all of this?
You have to
One
have
of the
something to track efficacy
Yeah,
of
so need
things.
to
Yeah.
track efficacy. So one of the things that is like for instance with the meetings, how efficient are the meetings being, especially when you're dealing with number of experiments, like prioritization meetings. How many tests are we prioritizing per meeting? If you've got a 1 hour prioritization session per week and you're only prioritizing like 3 or 4 tests, that's no good.
Right.
So there's some work that needs to be done there to make that more efficient. So maybe more process, maybe more automation, maybe something to make it more objective. In our case, it was too much discussion around subjectivity points, around like what is a potential for this test. So any sort of subjectivity had to be replaced by something that could be objectively calculated up until the moment where it kind of up to the point where you kind of go, well, all of this has been predetermined using our calculator. And if there are any issues with any one of these tests, discuss those specifically. Otherwise, you could just let the calculator do its thing and then just set it accordingly, unless somebody has an issue with it, and then that's a prioritization that happens. So yeah, so I think there's like different levels of uh, complexity and different ways of measuring certain things, but essentially just measure everything and just check everything's. You need to do an audit of your experimentation program. Now and again.
Right. And along those lines, saying track everything, let's get into the tech stack. So like what are all the actual thing like talked about like process and people, but then you need software to keep all that stuff organized as well. And there's, I
Yeah.
think, probably four basic components of tech that you need to run an experimentation program. You need your experiment metadata tracking. Uh, some system for writing down and recording all of your experiment metadata. Like I use Airtable. Somebody could use a spreadsheet. Somebody could use like effective experiments or what have you. Right? There's several different flavors, but that's something that you need to be tracking down. Where do you record down all of your test ideas, your hypotheses, test results? Like it needs to be in some sort of database. So, and you have to have all of those little metadata pieces that we've talked about many, many times before to sort and filter and track and organize so you can do meta analysis about the experiments that you're running.
Yes.
Yep.
And also like, it's and we discussed our love of Airtable, but it can be done in other sort of tools as well. And I used to use, because,
Lots of people start with just a spreadsheet,
yeah, yeah. But a spreadsheet is a really good start, but you really need to kind of
something
move
a
away
little bit
from
more
spreadsheet.
robust. Yeah.
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 I mean, Jira was a good one, and it's one that's kind of pretty common across a lot of companies. So see, like, developers are already tracking stuff in
Yeah.
Jira. So you can do that in Jira.
There's a distinction there though. Like Jira is, and this is the next component that's important, is project management system. So some way to track and organize and assign work being done itself. Now, I personally would advocate that your experiment metadata tracking should be separate from your project management system, but a lot of PMing tools have database structuring in some way so that if you wanted to, you could have the be an all-in-one solution. But the drawback there is too many eggs in one basket kind of thing.
Yeah, and I agree with you to a certain point actually, because because when I used to do it in from Jira, one of the things that got complicated is creating like dashboards and links to insights and links between experiments, and the metadata kind of linking between them was really tough. So it's a little bit of a challenge there, but the offset was kind of like, I think it was specific to the company that I was and the challenges that we had. The offset is that because a Jira ticket has got the history of all of the QA issues and stuff like that in there, all of that can be used as additional metadata to check how how quickly did a test go through development,
Mhm.
how quickly did a test pass QA, what were the big sort of issues, were how many times did it get blocked, were they, so all of that is embedded within that, is embedded within that ticket. But it does make, and you're right there, is that when it comes to analyzing for metadata, it becomes trickier. So one thing that I used to have to do is kind of like now and again look through, like, in terms of like looking at links, connections between experiments and seeing how things have been doing in terms of like blocks of experiments at a time. I have to like write up like a report or something, do some deep dive into, all the relationships, and just extract it all and just write it in a document. So, whereas you don't get a dashboard to easily display all of that, all those connections in a nice way, you can kind of like, you know, do it by just every month or so writing a report on all of the, what's been the progress between all the tests.
Mhm.
It's a little bit more manual, but it's still doable. And
Yeah.
it's an interesting task, at least to explore.
And you can use data piping systems to get information back and forth
Yeah.
between your
Yeah.
metadata base and your project management.
Yeah.
Like you can use Zapier, or depending on the software that you're using, like you may be able to integrate the two.
Yeah.
Like if you're using Airtable, um, I don't know the full list of like integrations that Airtable has, but it might have like say like a Jira integration where it's like if you do something in Airtable, it automatically creates a task in Jira for you, and then for like the granular like work product details, those live in Jira because that's where people were actually like entering their time and things like that. But then, like that can be referenced, say, in Airtable or something, and like when a particular milestone is reached, like that can like set a timestamp back in Airtable because you're not necessarily concerned with like all of the granular details of like this went through QA 12 times and and like what was the duration of each cycle? Like you might from a meta perspective only be concerned with, well, how long did QA take from start to finish, right? Like it's a milestone instead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of like one other major difference in terms of the tech stack is kind of that I see is kind of like client side versus server side. So I'm guessing like for an agency, you're going to be pretty much dealing with
Oh,
client
now
side.
you're moving on to talk about like text execution software. Like there's
Yes, right.
that's
Part
not
of the
there's not client side versus server side like experiment metadata tracking. No,
no,
that's a
no.
separate thing
Yeah,
entirely.
yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah,
separate.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So it's
Yeah, because
separate.
there's two right. Yeah, there's two other
There's two
components here.
aspects to the tech stack. There's
Yeah.
like the tech stack you use to measure the tests and to kind of track test progress and the program progress of and then there's the tech stack in terms of test delivery
Yeah.
network
Managing the work and doing the work.
doing the work. So one of the big differences I see is like, and it's not always a case that a company doing experimentation in house will have a certain number of tests, or maybe all tests being run server side. Again, not everyone would be in that position, but I think that is something that is certainly possible when you're working in house versus as an agency, you have to do things client side and then you have to liaise with with like a central point, maybe with somebody in a within a company to say, hey, these are the tests that we developed, this is what's happening, and blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. So so yeah, so how, like, I know from the tech stack server side, so there are certain sort of challenges there. I mentioned one, which was a major one, which is counting and the setting up of tests in the correct sort of way, where basically you have developers who are not specifically A/B test developers, but are
Mhm.
general full stack developers maybe, and they're having to create experiments or to code experiments in a way that will still be data, still maintain data integrity, and will still be optimized in terms of like how long it takes for them to develop, and not having to go through doing all of um, the 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 test kits and setting up all of those kind of like additional bits around like a new feature versus you and like having an agency to deal with how do you deal with that in terms of like, do you speak to or do you have somebody specifically to speak to the client, or is it like on an ad hoc basis?
Yeah, this is also another topic that we discussed last week was including engineering effort in test prioritization.
Hmm.
Yeah, and the tech stack, and then like the level of complexity of experiments that you're running, that plays a factor into that as
Yeah.
well. Um, for us, at least, like on our agency side, like our service offering is that we're basically end to end experiment retainer offering. So like everything from ideation to execution. The one piece we stop short on is like implementing change on client sites, right? Because
Mm.
we're offering like the CRO experimentation services. We're not actually like, you know, like a development agency, like we're not running and managing clients' websites themselves. So, like the actual tech stack for how the site is constructed is independent of the CRO service. And it would be too onerous to say like, "Oh yeah, sure, our engineers can do implementation," because, like if we're managing 20 client accounts, there could be 10 different tech stacks for how to, engineer and implement changes on company sites. And that's just too complicated, and too diverse of an offering to say, "Yeah, sure, we can do that."
Cool. And how about like in terms of liaising with the client? Do you have like a somebody to manage that that sort of?
Yes. Yeah. So there's always gonna be um like some sort of like this person is like the client facing main point of contact for the service. Now, the agency that I work for, there's multiple service offerings. So, a single client may be utilizing multiple services. They might be utilizing paid search, paid social, and or CRO services. And so, like, because 2 out of those 3 departments are fairly new, we're actually still working out, like, what's the process going to be for a client that's doing that's utilizing multiple offerings. Because, think about it like, well, you need to have, like, the department's subject matter expert communicating information to that client, but they're gonna be the subject matter just for that department. And it's probably too burdensome on the client to say, "Hey, we need to do separate calls for each department," because there's probably like some sort of regular cadence for client meetings. And if it's like, oh, if the client's utilizing all 3 services, like, do they wanna have 3 meetings a week with us for, 30 minutes to an hour each time? Like, that's too much. So, potentially, like, figuring that out, like, and maybe it's multiple people on one call, or maybe things get serviced to, like, an account rep or something like that, right? There's a couple different ways to approach that. Now, the drawback of having, like, a singular account rep that's communicating everything, well, then, like, multiple service offering, does that account rep need to be then, like, an expert in everything because they need to communicate, things coming from 3 different departments or something like that. So, yeah,
That's interesting.
not an easy answer from the agency side.
Yeah, it's not in, and it in fact, I was thinking that there's probably one big differentiator between working agency versus working internally is that you need that kind of conduit, that person to communicate between them. But in actual fact, I was actually thinking that this might be one of the areas that we needed when we were working in house, because one good thing about like having that conduit, that person to communicate with the client, is that the overall performance of an experiment program is being communicated to a general audience. And that I think is something that could get lost a little bit in in-house teams, because, how do you, I mean, the product owner would normally communicate that sort of thing with the general senior higher uppers. And then you'd have to have a, a CRO head who would then communicate how all of the teams are doing in general in terms of experimentation. But it's kind of one of those things where it's probably was a skill set in itself, and it's probably
Yes.
something that
Yeah.
it is having somebody who's specifically designed to communicate and
This could be an entire subject all on its
yeah,
own,
yeah,
is how to communicate out experiment
yeah,
results. Like,
yeah.
what kind of information should you convey and on what cadence? And in fact, there should be like multiple cadences for different types of reporting and like the audience that each thing should go to and stuff.
Yeah.
Like if in a small organization, sure, maybe it makes sense to send out the full experiment report to
Mm,
everybody so they can
mm.
read. Like you're a startup and there's like 10 people on the team. It's probably important for all 10 people to know like what the results of those experiments are because they're all 10 of them are invested in the success. But if you're at like that's very different for a company of like 100 or 200 people. Like, it doesn't make sense to communicate like a full experiment report out to the entire company, let alone maybe even like the entire like even an entire department or something like
Yeah,
that. Like,
I
there's
know.
levels of like summarization and things that are
Summarization. Yeah,
dependent on your audience.
yeah. And one of the things that we had that I've remember doing, or rather, there were other teams that did that. Is product owners would each week kind of round up the key kind of events that took place and what the key opportunities were, etc., etc. Um, but I think one thing that probably could be done better is to having a much more joined up sort of communication to all of the necessary people. And there's lots of different types of communication, like you said, that needed to be done. And some of it was a little bit too much information. I didn't read, sort of, fell into that
TLDR type.
situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Whereas finding that right balance and and having a client liaison, from an agency to company, because you're paying this agency, that liaison becomes really important, and then that bridge to that end client is kind
Yeah, I
of
think I seem to recall Manuel has some pretty interesting insight
yeah,
about
yeah,
this. Like, he did quite a bit of research and sort of had these like um defined roles in terms of like communication and scope and like how like this person advocates for this thing or that thing and they're doing some stuff. Yeah.
And speaking of Manuel, there's one thing that I want to cover off right here, because we're purposely not going to get into the talking about how to promote experimentation, how to
Mhm.
move a experimentation culture onwards, because and I'm with Manuel on this with my experience at the other companies. Um, us as CRO people doing all of the work, they're not the right people to be running that culture, or they're not going to be able to make change any.
We should have him on and do a whole discussion
We
around.
should do a
Yeah.
whole discussion around this, because without the senior buy-in, you're not going to get anywhere. So you can certainly help somebody with their senior buy-in, but you can't
Yeah.
control that.
All the
Yeah.
stuff that we've been talking about today assumes that like buy-in but all that stuff's already been like we're needing to do the work now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is everything's been the hard work's been done. Now it's just like the
The hard work's
ongoing.
been done. Now it's time to do the hard work.
And now it's time to do the hard work. Yes. Cool.
Good.
So I think this was an interesting discussion. I think like this is something that I really would like to get many more views on, in terms of what were the challenges, because there's so many different types of
Perspectives,
perspectives and
per
stuff like that.
additional perspectives. I mean, it would
Yeah.
be nice to get more views on the videos, but,
Yes, we can't control our well, up to a certain point.
Yes, excellent. So, if you ever have any questions or feedback about topics that we've discussed, either here on the podcast or at the roundtable, you can always talk to me and Iqbal face to face every Friday at the Sierra Roundtable, which you can join at conversionworld.co, and you can find the event link there. If you're shy or you don't like speaking, you can always connect with us on LinkedIn as well. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.